And thank you for joining us for Mountain Housing Council Speaker Series. This series is an opportunity to dive deeper into a variety of housing topics from today's session on new California legislation and what it means for our region to pass topics on short-term rental ordinances and key housing terms. The format for today's meeting will be a 30-minute presentation from our speakers: Steve Frisch, President of Sierra Business Council; Jenna Gatto, Planning Manager of the Town of Truckee; and Devin, McNally, Associate Planner for Placer County. Following our presentation, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. We ask that you wait until the speakers finish their presentations to ask your question by using the raise hand feature or by putting your question in the chat box. You can put questions in the chat box at any time. However, we will wait until the end to address them. This meeting is being recorded and review and can be reviewed after this session on our website, mountainhousingcouncil.org. Before I introduce our speakers, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the Mountain Housing Council and who we are for anyone who isn't yet familiar with us. I'm just going to share my screen. Great. So the Mountain Housing Council is a project of the Tahoe Truckee Community Foundation, whose mission is to connect people and opportunities, generating resources to build a more caring, creative, and effective community. Many of you know us for our grant making and scholarship work. Our mission-based initiative work includes forest futures and family strengthening through the Community Collaborative Program. Additionally, we have spearheaded emergency response dollars to the community, and we have made a first-time impact investment with the Artist Fund into the Truckee Artists Lofts. We are led by a very talented board of directors, and I believe we have a board of director on the call today, but I don't see their camera on. Maybe you could just introduce yourself quickly. Well, thank you for joining us. Oh, hi. Oops, sorry, it looks like I went ahead on the slide. Nicole, thank you for joining us. I appreciate it.
Absolutely, my pleasure to be here. I think there may be some of my colleagues as well joining. I don't think I'm the only one dialing in, but I'm pleased to be here.
Oh, great. Well, we're very excited to have you join us. And we also have some of our staff with us, but they also have their camera off, so I'm not sure who it is. Maybe you could turn your camera on so we can see you. Well, thank you for joining us. Oh, it's Allison. Hi, Allison.
Hey, Christina, it's Allison.
Thanks for joining us. And also joining us today, we have some elected officials in the room. So we have Vice Mayor of the Town of Truckee, Lindsay Romack. Thank you, Lindsay, for joining us. And then we also have Council Member Dave Polizzi joining us. Thank you, Dave. And so I just want to go back to who we are. The Mountain Housing Council brings together 29 diverse stakeholders: business, local governments, community groups, special districts, and housing advocates to take on the unique and pressing challenges of achievable local housing in the North Lake Tahoe region. We know that there is a need for housing at every income level, from homelessness to middle income salary earners. We elevate and educate our regional housing needs in the community through outreach, education, and by tracking data. Another way that we complete the work is through working groups and tiger teams. These groups are representatives from our partner agencies as well as community volunteers. We currently have 4 working groups. We have a policy working group led by Steve Frisch and the Sierra Business Council, a supportive housing and homelessness working group, a private employers housing network, and the funders network. The work for these groups is ongoing. Our Tiger Teams work has a beginning and an end, and we'll be launching 2 new Tiger Teams soon. One focused on advancing a regional hub and the other on emergency housing solutions. I will put my email in the chat box. And if anyone is interested in joining one of our groups, please contact me. So with no further delay, I'd like to introduce the topic for today and our first speaker. On January 1st, 2022, Senate Bill 9 and 10 were enacted in California as a way to address a shortage of middle-income housing and small multifamily housing developments near jobs and transit centers. These are developments with fewer than 10 homes for the SB 10. These bills received a lot of press, and also due to the speed at which they were passed came with a lot of questions on how to implement them. Today, we bring together our housing experts to help us reach a fuller understanding of the implications of these bills in our region. We will hear from Steve Frisch first. Steve is the president of the Sierra Business Council and also leads the Mountain Housing Council's Policy Working Group. The goal of the Policy Working Group is to increase opportunities to build achievable housing in the North Lake Tahoe region. The working group tracks state and federal legislation and advocates for our region at the state level. Steve will give us an overview of these bills, and next we will hear from Jenna Gatto and Devin McNally about what it means for Truckee and Placer County. And Steve, I'll invite you to speak now.
Great, thanks Christina, and thanks to everyone for being here today. So as Christina said, I'm Steve Frisch with the Sierra Business Council. We run the Policy Working Group, but we've also been tracking in particular the development of SB 9 for several years. As many of you know, there have been preceding legislative efforts to do essentially what SB 9 does, which is give every residential lot the right to split down to 4 units on that parcel if they elect to do so based on kind of local implementation policy. There have been at least 2 previous efforts to pass legislation similar to SB 9, and it was just last year that SB 9 passed. Next slide, please. The legislative rationale for SB 9 was really fourfold in the discussion in the legislature. The first was that new building permits in California were failing to keep pace with household creation, and that has been the case for really going on about 15 years now. The second was that California needs to build, based on recent analysis, about 4 million new residential units by 2040. And there was a lot of concern about whether or not that was doable without some relatively aggressive policy like SB 9 to lead the effort on that. The legislature looked to a couple of other programs around the country as examples or models to model SB 9 on, including a successful program in Minneapolis that is in the middle of implementation at this point. The third rationale was that California has the highest percentage of housing burdened households in the nation. And as you all know, housing burden is often a driver of poverty. The more you pay in your income for housing, the more likely you are to fall into poverty. And housing burden is considered one of the highest factors in California's poverty rate. And California now has the highest poverty rate in the nation, largely due to housing costs. Next slide, please. So California's need to build 4 million new residential units by 2040 has largely been driven by this dynamic that roughly since 2007, the gap between essentially the number of units that we're giving construction permits for and the need based on household creation in the state has been widening. If you were to take this chart out to 2020, you would see that that gap has continued that widening curve that you see here. Next slide, please. This is another projection of that data. You'll note that in 1986, we issued more than 300,000 permits. In 2004 to 2006, we were issuing around 200,000 permits a year across the state of California. And since the Great Recession, we've been hovering right around that 100,000 permit level. So if you were to extend that slide to 2020, you would see that we've barely inched above 100,000 permits at about 110,000 in 2020. And the state's housing policy that is being drafted right now is identifying a need to go back up to that 250 to 300,000 unit level within the next 3 years if we're going to meet the goal by 2030. Next slide, please. And of course, the result of that is that California has the highest percentage of housing burdened households in the nation. Actually, that is, this data is even a little bit old. If you look at the housing burden maps from 2020 from HUD, you'll see that about 6 other counties have slipped into that more than 40% range. And California housing analysis shows that about 30 to 40% of houses in California are paying more than 50% in housing costs. Next slide, please. And largely due to housing as a driver of cost, California has the highest poverty rate in the nation. And that is kind of a remarkable statistic when you think about the point that we're up against, like Alabama and Louisiana, and a lot of other places. But this is the sad truth in California, that our poverty rate is above 20%. There's a little bit of improvement in that this year due to the child tax credit programs and other things. But the reality is California is expected to be back up in the #1 spot again by 2022. So as a result of that, next slide, please. The legislature passed last year SB 9. I'm going to talk primarily about SB 9 today and less about SB 10. And SB 9 as a measure requires local governments to come up with a process to ministerially approve a housing development containing 2 residential units in single-family zones. And then each one of those residential units would be able to essentially, the local government would be required to ministerially approve a lot split. So we'll see in a minute what the impact of that is. And I think Jenna's going to go into more detail about what that looks like in Truckee and Devin in Placer. But I think it's important to remember as we're talking about this, what the legislative intent of this is, which is essentially what is going to lead implementation and kind of analysis of implementation in the subsequent years. So the legislative intent that was published was that it was designed to streamline the process for a homeowner to create a duplex or subdivide an existing lot. Any new housing created as a result of this bill must meet a specific list of qualifications that protects historic districts, preserves environmental quality and the look of communities, and prevents tenants from being displaced. So there is an anti-displacement provision in it as well. And the idea is that this legislation would enable homeowners to create intergenerational wealth and provide access to more rental and ownership options for working families in order to avoid their being priced out of neighborhoods. So as the Attorney General's office is looking at how local jurisdictions are implementing SB 9, they often go back to this legislative intent language to determine whether or not they think the ordinances are meeting the intent of the legislature. And you may have seen some recent media around SB 9 implementation being controversial in several areas, with certain types of carve-outs being designed for things like as varied as mountain lion habitat and slope areas and other things. Those are really going to be largely up to local jurisdictions to come up with implementing ordinances that that address those issues. Next slide, please. So this slide just is intended to simply kind of show graphically what the intent of the legislation is. So there are 4 scenarios here. On a vacant lot, what would be allowed on a vacant lot would be up to 2 units and 2 ADUs or junior ADUs. Or you could do a lot split with a unit and an ADU on each lot, but it's a total of 4 units. If there's already a single family home, it would allow up to 2 units and 2 ADUs, and that could be done with or without a lot split. If it was already a non-conforming duplex or a duplex, you could split that up to a total of 4 units. And then the same is true with a single family home and an ADU. You could add essentially another single family home and another ADU. So as I'm sure all of you are aware, this is going to be a mad scramble for jurisdictions across the state of California to adopt implementing ordinances. Truckee has been in the forefront of that, much to their credit. So it's going to be interesting to see how everyone implements this. Next slide, please. There has been some analysis about what the potential impact of SB 9 will be on housing supply and on essentially community character and other things done by the Turner Center on housing and innovation, which I would definitely recommend people go take a look at. Their finding was that SB 9's primary impact would likely be to unlock incrementally more units on parcels that are already financially feasible under existing law, and typically through a subdivision, but that relatively few new single-family parcels are expected to become financially feasible for added units. This is Turner Center's analysis essentially thinks this is one small part of closing that 4 million home gap across the state of California, and that it will have only an incremental impact, but that it's an important piece of solving the puzzle. Next slide, please. The next steps for this process, our local jurisdictions are passing implementing ordinances, which we're going to hear about today from Jenna and Devin. There could be cleanup legislation in this legislative session to clarify the legislative intent. There are still some questions, as you'll hear from our two jurisdictions, about specifically what that legislative intent is. This has been identified, that is, implementation of SB 9 has been identified as a top priority by the California Attorney General's office, and they have already weighed in across the state with several jurisdictions about implementing ordinances. As you might guess, this was a pretty controversial piece of legislation, and there has been opposition to it across different regions of the state. There is a statewide coalition called Our Neighborhood Voices, which has filed a ballot initiative with the Secretary of State's office to place a constitutional amendment on the California ballot in November to restrict SB 9 and to kind of pull back SB 9 and SB 10's implementation powers by the state. The Mountain Housing Policy Working Group is going to continue to track this implementation process and collect model ordinances. And if there is cleanup legislation on SB 9, we are likely to weigh in on that. So the way to have your voice heard in that is to participate in our policy working group meetings. And we'll, of course, be updating the Mountain Housing Council on that as we go forward. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Steve, so much. So next we will hear from Jenna Gatto, who is with the town of Truckee, and as Steve said, they did pass an urgency ordinance at the beginning of this year and are working at fully developing their ordinance. And so Jenna, take it away.
Thanks, Christina. Do you have my slides loaded? Perfect. Okay, go ahead to the next one. That one. Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. Happy to be here. This is an exciting time, as you all are probably figuring out. As Steve mentioned, this has been a long haul for the state. This has been an idea that's been kicked around for a number of years. Before last year, there were 3 different bills, all of which failed. Finally, SB 9 was signed into law back in September. What that meant is that it didn't give us enough time to get a permanent ordinance into effect, just given the time frame between when it was signed into law and when it became law on January 1st. So back in December, the town put together an urgency ordinance. 2 of the attendees in this meeting approved that ordinance. We've got 2 town council members here. And luckily, we were able to get this in right before the law went into effect. And what you'll hear from a lot of folks is that SB 9 has really been talked about as kind of the end of single family zoning in California. That sort of remains to be seen. There were, steps made toward this previously with ADUs and JADUs. So it's really just kind of a transition that we've been seeing. Go ahead to the next slide, Christina. Yeah, that one. So Steve went into this, and I won't go into it into a lot of detail, but there's really two things that happened with adoption of SB 9. There's one that's called an urban lot split. So that's basically taking one single family lot and subdividing it into two new parcels. And then there are a myriad of other ways, and Steve had a great graphic on that, that's called 2-unit projects. And that's a variety of different ways that you can get to a total of 4 units. So by either a lot split and or a 2-unit project, what's now possible under SB 9 is the creation of 4 units. And then there's actually a potential way to get a 5th unit on unsubdivided lots, but I won't go into the details on that one. But that's really, if there's anything you want to take home with you today, that there's 2 ways to get to 4 units now on single family parcels in the state of California. Go ahead to the next slide. Yep, that one. Okay, so really what this means is that it resulted in some pretty substantial changes that we needed to make in the town of Truckee. First is, and Steve mentioned this, it must be done by a ministerial process. So what that means is previously these types of projects would go to a public hearing. You would have someone like a zoning administrator or the planning commission or even the town council would be making this decision on a subdivision. That's no longer. These will happen at the staff level. So what that means is that there's basically no public hearing that's associated. There's also no CEQA process that happens as a result of this being at the staff level. So both of those will happen considerably faster than they would have previously. It also means that anything that we are approving needs to be subject to what are called objective design standards. This is also a huge change. What this means is that everything needs to be objective, meaning someone who isn't trained as a planner or an architect or an attorney, they can interpret those standards the same way as someone with training, that they're very clear, they're black and white, there's no question involved in what is the standard that's being applied. We don't have these in effect right now. We are actually in the process of creating these for all sections of our development code, which you can imagine if your code is this thick, you've got to go through that and make a bunch of changes. So we're in the process there as well. And then lastly, SB 9 itself has its own size and design standards that were not part of our previous code. So again, short story, our previous processes were not set up for this, so we had to very quickly go in and make a number of changes to our processes so that the town is compliant with SB 9. Go ahead to the next one. So what I won't go into a ton of detail on the next slide, there is, yep, that's it. SB 9 has a whole bunch of rules. I won't go into a lot of detail. You can certainly pull up our ordinance and see all of these in print. What this means is these are the requirements that every city and county in the state of California has to comply with. So there's things like you can't work in concert with a neighbor. It shows you how large each lot has to be, what your setbacks are, that you can't correct nonconformities through an SB 9 lot split. There's just a variety of different regulations that were put into place. Go ahead to the next slide. And then the same thing is true for 2-unit projects. So there's a lot of overlap with the 2-unit projects. So there's some unique requirements that were put into place. All of these have been incorporated into our ordinance that we adopted back in December. Go ahead to the next slide. So as I mentioned, we are looking at this as a 2-phase process, and many jurisdictions across the state are in the same boat. So in mid-December, we adopted an urgency ordinance that was admittedly very hastily done. We really did not have much time at all to create a new ordinance from scratch. And what we did is we took the bare bone requirements of SB 9 and incorporated those into a new ordinance. We added a few Truckee specific items that we felt were of supreme importance, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then really what we said to anyone that was interested in this topic is that we would come back once we got our urgency ordinance in place, and we would adopt a permanent ordinance that really gets at a lot of the minutia, a lot of the questions that have come up out of SB 9. It would give us more time to do a more robust community outreach process, which we admittedly weren't able to do given the short time frame between September and January. And at this point, we have not yet started that phase 2, but we expect to in the near future. Go ahead to the next slide. So for those who are interested in town of Truckee regulations, we did have a few things that we put in, which we are allowed to do. And really they were based on what we felt was necessary for Truckee in particular, in response to some of our unique climatic needs. We also recognize that we have a lot of subdivisions that are still not hooked up to municipal infrastructure, and that was a concern that we had. So we basically tailored our urgency ordinance to address some immediate things that we felt were important, and then recognizing that there would be subsequent conversations about many different things like should, properties that are not hooked up to municipal infrastructure. So an example, there would be a property that's on a septic system. Is that one that should be eligible for an SB 9 lot split? We haven't yet answered that question. For now, we said no, but with the option to discuss that as we proceed. Go ahead to the next slide. So SB 9, Steve mentioned that SB 9 has been controversial. There's been lots and lots of discussion over the last year or two. Really what it presents for all local jurisdictions is, I would say, both opportunities and challenges. There's the question, Steve mentioned the Turner report, is this going to result in more housing? The near answer appears to be not a tremendous amount of housing, but that it might be some. There's a question, will it result in more affordable housing? That's a big question mark, because at this point, our position is we can't actually restrict these units for affordable housing. I won't get into the why. If you want to know more about that, feel free to reach out to me. So there's really a question of, what is going to be the result of all the new housing? Something that's also important to understand, there's no CEQA required. So from a cost and time standpoint, that's certainly huge. Steve also mentioned the intent is that there's benefits to both existing homeowners and then future renters. So we see benefit there. I will say, no question, the biggest challenge that many cities and counties have raised is that this is no doubt a one-size-fits-all approach that has been really difficult for jurisdictions like the town, where we don't have year-round on-street parking. We've got lots of properties that are not in, in a municipal environment. It's very clear that SB 9 is geared toward urban areas, and we don't really see us as a true urban area, especially in light of all the non-municipal infrastructure that we have in the town. And really what it's resulted is in a ton of work for us to do in an environment when we're already pretty busy. So we are, doing our best to rise to this challenge. And yet at the same time, we envision that this will be pretty slow because there is quite a bit for us to work on. So the last thing I will touch on is the next slide, which is what we foresee happening in our phase 2 discussion. I mentioned this, there are a lot of things that are not in our urgency ordinance currently. There's questions about how large should home sizes be? Should hillside preservation be something we're looking at? Obviously, there's the fire risk issue. Many of our neighborhoods are in very high fire hazard severity zones. And how do we address that? Recognizing that the state basically has an exemption to this and is encouraging homes in these exact areas through SB 9. So we're trying to work through that. Questions on, what zone district should this be allowed in? Should we look at rural residential, which are typically areas that aren't on municipal infrastructure? And then really recognizing that we have a lot of work we would like to do with our community partners, the utility providers that are also impacted by SB 9, and then a number of homeowner associations, which are also at the same time trying to wrap their heads around this new legislation. So that's it. I will wrap up. I know we've got Devin waiting to talk about Placer County, and then obviously I'm happy to answer any questions at the end.
Great, thank you so much, Jenna. Just going to pull up Placer's slides. So next, I would like to invite Devin to speak about what this means for Placer County. He'll be speaking generally for Placer County, but also giving us some specific detail for our region. Please go ahead, Devin.
Thanks, Christina. So Placer County has taken an approach a little different from the town. If you want to go to the next slide. So we have processes already in place that we can handle Senate Bill 9 lot splits. And so they'll be similar to what we call our minor land division process. And then similarly, we're also in the process of adopting some code and ordinances to address duplexes as well as through what we're calling our multifamily and mixed use design manual. So if you go to the next slide, in the east part of the county, there is not a lot of SB 9 eligible areas. So what you see there are the red cross hatching is our very high fire hazard areas in which we are limiting any sort of lot splits. The blue area is the Tahoe Basin Area Plan. Since that area is governed by TRPA, it is not subject to SB 9. So those areas actually won't have urban lot splits or the second unit. So that just leaves that yellow area up in the north, which is the lone kind of area on the backside of Truckee that is an urbanized area that would be afforded SB 9 opportunities on the east side. Most of Placer County's urbanized areas with RS zoning are located in the western slope and kind of the valley. The areas around our incorporated cities that include Roseville, Rockland, Lincoln, and Loomis, and then also Auburn. So if you go to the next slide, we had done a breakdown of kind of where these parcels are, and we call them our community plans. And you can see the Martis Valley Community Plan is the only area in the eastern slope. So it's about 235 parcels. So it's about 2% of the parcels that would be afforded SB 9 lot splits or SB 9 duplexes as part of the county. Most of these are on septic and well water, and they would be handled through our environmental health department. So when an application would come in, they would have to meet the specific objective standards laid out in our land development manual and in what we call our Chapter 16 of our county code, which governs subdivisions. So we're not expecting a lot currently at the moment. We're talking with TRPA, kind of what they plan to do going forward. But in terms of the county itself, right now, we don't see a lot of changes happening, especially given that it's in a very small area of this county with respect to East Placer. So that's kind of where we're at the moment. We will be bringing forward some minor changes to kind of clarify the process of applications in the next month or so, and that will deal with the subdivision, and then we'll be evaluating applications as they come in and then making any changes to our zoning ordinance based on some of these kind of early applications. We've only had one pre-application so far, and we've had a number of kind of questions regarding SB 9, but most of these individuals are located in the western portion of the county. We haven't had a lot of interest on the east side currently. So I think that is everything on our end of the equation. Like I said, we have fewer urbanized areas, and since it doesn't apply to the basin itself, This means that a lot of the SB9 parcels where development does occur are not covered.
And Christina, before we open it to questions, I might answer a question that I know is going to be asked and that is hot around the state, which is, what is the impact of SB9 on homeowners associations that have CC&Rs that restrict lot splits? So that is one of the issues that may need legislative cleanup. SB9 was agnostic on the issue, that is, it did not address that issue in the legislation. Subsequent to the passage of the legislation, Senator Tony Atkins submitted a letter to the Secretary of State's office and the Attorney General's office stating that it was not the legislative intent to apply SB9 to homeowners associations with CC&Rs that restrict lot splits, but a letter from a member of the legislature doesn't have legal standing. So even though the legislative council says the language essentially does not include HOAs, theoretically, it could be applied to HOAs if someone were to litigate to do that. So I think this is one of those issues that is going to need to be cleaned up in future legislation that is hanging out there, and that I know people in the housing committee in the legislature have been talking about. So I just want to take that issue off the table before we start with the questions and answers. So
I appreciate that. Thank you, Steve. So I'm going to go through the chat box, and then I think there are a few questions in there. And then Jenna Gatto does need to leave early to attend the Town of Truckee's Planning Commission meeting at 5. So if there are additional questions, we'll address them to Jenna first and then open them up to everyone else. And as you noted about the HOA, Steve, you also noted that SB9 does not allow for STR use. So thank you for putting that in the chat. And Danny, I think I saw you turn on your camera, but you had a few questions in the chat, and so we'll start with your first one. The first one was about enforcement. And so we'll turn it over to you guys to answer that. And then Danny did follow it up with, particularly since the intent was to create intergenerational wealth rather than specifically to create affordable housing.
Yeah, I'm sorry, how would what be enforced? I'm trying to read the chat. The 3-year owner occupancy?
well, he wasn't specific about what would be enforced. I think there are a number of elements.
So it kind of came up when you were talking about all the different barriers, Jenna, when we were on that slide. And so, and I don't want to speak for you, Danny. Do you want to elaborate when?
The one that I was specifically thinking of at that moment was that it was, I think you had said that it was specific that it couldn't be short-term rentals.
Correct.
And Stephen had replied that it would be, that there would be a 3-year ownership requirement, but I don't know.
Actually, the law specifically states they can't be used for short-term rentals. My 3-year ownership thing was getting to that intergenerational wealth question. Was that one of the provisions of SB9 is that if there's a lot split, the unit has to be occupied, or if there's a second unit, the owner has to remain on the site. I think there's a lot of issues in here that are going to be really hard to enforce.
Yes.
That people have not figured out yet how much tracking they're going to need to do, similar to the way the town tracks STRs right now, how much tracking they're going to need to do on these parcels in order to enforce the law.
Yeah, I would concur. We are not staffed to enforce many of the aspects of SB9, and I would argue that's one of the problems with it. I mean, we'll certainly do our best, but depending on how many of these we get, we just don't have the staffing to properly enforce it. And I would suspect many jurisdictions across the state are in that same boat.
Well, and then essentially what happens is that then means enforcement becomes complaint-based rather than programmatic, right?
Yeah.
So the law becomes unevenly enforced, and it leaves homeowners in a situation where they don't know whether or not what they're doing is actually in violation or not, because there's not a system for really tracking the violations.
Well, and we're not really clear what the penalty is if someone doesn't comply. It's not written into the legislation. So it's really unclear if what happens if someone breaks that rule.
Thank you. Does that answer your question, Danny? Great. So the next question is from Philip. How will the town handle the high fire hazard lots since that covers most of the town? Sounds like Placer County will clearly not allow them.
Well, we are allowing them because the Truckee Fire Protection District has mitigation measure requirements currently in place. And so because of that, SB 9 says that we have to allow those.
And I will say on the county side, most of these areas are state fire responsibility areas as opposed to local fire districts. And so that is the big key difference there. I will also say for most of those areas, since it's a large county, the areas that are in the very high fire hazard area are mostly not single family or urbanized areas.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Danny.
I could think of all sorts of questions, so just cut me off when somebody else wants to ask.
No, go ahead.
So I thought the count for Placer County was really interesting, and I wondered if you guys knew the sort of numbers that you were talking about for Truckee, or if anybody happens to know for Nevada County.
And are you talking to his chart on the lot splits? So I can pull that.
Yeah, sort of how many lots are we actually potentially talking about? Yeah.
We do not have a set number, in part because we have a lot of HOAs that are likely taking the position that SB 9 doesn't apply to them. That'll be part of some of the additional research that we do as part of phase 2 is to try to determine what number of units we could foresee actually having SB 9 subdivisions happening.
And have you seen any applications at all under this law? Somebody that was just waiting around, waiting for something to be legal?
Yes, we have one application right now in the town of Truckee, and it is someone that was waiting in part because what they wanted to do didn't work under the ADU legislation. It's a tiny lot over near Donner Lake, and it's a 5,000 square foot lot. And the gentleman that owns it is proposing a lot that would be 3,000 square feet and 2,000 square feet. So it'll be very interesting to see how that works in Truckee, over by Donner Lake in particular.
Do you expect to see more applicants now that the law is enacted? And it sounds like there'll be some public outreach from the jurisdictions, and Mountain Housing Council can help with series like these.
For us, I'll just answer it, Devin. I don't know. It sounds like you maybe don't think you'll see a ton, at least over on the east side. We're not real sure, again, because the HOA question is still out there, and most of our single family residential properties are in HOAs. So those property owners will have to work with their HOAs to determine if they're willing to comply or if they're going to fight. We will approve them if they come to us because we're mandated to approve them if they comply with the SB 9 ordinance.
I think for the county, we're expecting to see a handful in the first probably year or so, and then seeing that kind of similar with ADUs, a kind of steady increase over the years as people kind of start to understand the law and understand what they can do under it. And that we anticipate, similar to with the ADU legislation, there will be some cleanups that do happen that address possible holes or gaps, and that will kind of increase. That said, with Eastern Placer, because most of our single family zone districts are in the basin, we don't anticipate a large increase or any number of applications, probably 1 or 2 over the next couple of years on East Placer.
Yeah, and if the other locations that have implemented this in the past, most notable, the one probably most closely tracked is Minneapolis, and if the behavior there is exemplary of the behavior in California, which I don't think is automatically a given, there was there was a handful to begin with as people were testing the law, essentially, and testing the idea. And then it tapered down, and then they've gradually seen a gradual increase in applications, but mostly in urbanized areas, on services, with transit corridors, and in places where that second unit could be used predominantly by a family member, which has been a really interesting aspect of this, that it goes kind of a little beyond the ADU law and allows for greater density and more units, but a lot of those units are actually being used for that intergenerational wealth issue, to create another unit for a family member or whatever. So I think the jury's out on whether or not California will follow that pattern.
Do you know where is it, Minneapolis, aesthetically, how those units have turned out for the city?
So they don't have the same design guideline requirements that SB 9 has. So they are required to meet their city design guideline standards. So it has not been a big issue in Minneapolis. As a matter of fact, it's been seen as kind of a driver of urban renewal. But I think that's a really interesting question for SB 9, what those standards that the town or the local jurisdictions are going to set that are essentially, you know, as Jenna put it, applicable to every unit and clearly understood by the public, right? Like what those standards are going to make a big difference as far as how the aesthetics work out. And Jenna, if I understand the law correctly, you can set different standards for different zoning districts too, correct?
Yeah, you can, as long as they're objective and they don't preclude 2 800 square foot homes on each lot.
So you could say it has to be a log cabin, and then that's it, right? Like if you could think of a way to describe what it has to be so that it's clear, then you could do it that way, right?
Generally, yes. Yeah, I mean, I will say there is no case law associated with SB 9 at this point, given that it's only 2 months old. So until there's case law, I would say generally, yes.
Well, and I think that's a really important observation, because I do think there will be a number of jurisdictions across California trying to control what they perceive to be the proliferation of units by implementing higher design standards for these units that will then be challenged, and it will be kind of that reasonableness standard that you often see on the application of the law, right? Is it consistent? Is it reasonable? Is it, and I think that's something that will probably take a decade to shake out, you know.
Well, thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay, well, that's very helpful. Is that typical when new legislation is enacted, that it takes years to kind of sort out the legal process of it and develop full ordinances?
It seems to be with prominent housing legislation like this.
Yeah.
Especially as we're seeing more and more cooks in the kitchen. You've got labor interests, you've got environmental interests, you've got YIMBYs, you've got NIMBYs, you've got, you know, everybody, fire, etc. And what happens then is you get this piece of legislation that's perfectly imperfect, and then it gets litigated. So yeah, I suspect if SB 9 sticks around, if it survives the ballot initiative, that there'll likely be many years of case law headed our way.
Mm-hmm.
There's another really interesting dynamic that the more controversial a piece of legislation is, often the less specific it becomes, because you can't keep your coalitions together if it's too specific. And then it becomes a question of interpretation, case law, cleanup legislation that actually further defines it, right? So like, in my humble opinion, SB 9 is kind of a pretty loose, it did not provide a lot of guidance to local jurisdictions, leaving them in Jenna's unfortunate and Devin's unfortunate position of having to interpret all of this, right? And my guess is they'll be going back to change the rules around this for many years to come.
And to kind of build off of Stephen's point, this is kind of the new standard that the state is taking, which is a very outcomes-based approach as opposed to a shall or shall not approach. And it means jurisdictions have to get to certain outcomes as opposed to telling us what we can and can't do. And so that has been a process in our county of kind of figuring out, for example, with multifamily housing, we started in 2017 a process of updating some of our multifamily standards. Now those standards are really just up to par with state code. They were ahead of the curve in the past 5 years with all the new legislation. It is really constrained and boxed in jurisdictions for how much latitude we have to regulate development, especially through discretionary processes.
Yeah, and Devin makes a really good point. I think, you know, in our last Mountain Housing Council policy meeting, we talked about the point that there's a lot of money in the state budget this year for housing programs. And there was a lot last year as well, more than we've ever seen before. But in the governor's budget message, he also stated that they were working on a new statewide housing strategy. And we've been talking to housing and community development and some of the legislative staffers about what that's likely to look like. And it is a much more outcomes-based approach. So for example, on your regional housing needs allocation or RHNA number, are you actually meeting it? And you know, on the number of units in transit corridors and things like that, are we meeting the targets? And then future legislation likely to be focused around trying to meet targets. Now, whether or not they set that 4 million home by 2020 objective, which is what we've been hearing talked about, up from, by the way, 3.5 million only 3 years ago. That's another story. Like that would be an unprecedented level of building and development in California for them to be shooting for. But I think you can expect more of these, more legislation focused on trying to push local jurisdictions to meet specific outcomes.
And just before Jenna has to hop off, which I know are 5 minutes, there is a question in the chat from Philip, and he has many design-related questions. He wants to know who the best contact at the town is regarding parking details, building spacing, fire sprinklers, etc.
Philip, you can just call our main line. We've got planners that staff our counter and our phones, and they're familiar with all the SB 9 regulations. We've done some trainings on it, and they'll be able to answer your questions. And then if you've got fire sprinkler questions, you would need to direct that to the building division, and they'll be able to help you.
And Philip, I can look up the number for you and share it with you after. And we will put a recording link on our website and send it after, so that if anybody wants to refer back to this meeting, they can. And then Devin and Jenna, I can talk to you separately, but if you're willing to share your slides, we can also make those available or make contact information available.
Yeah, of course. You're welcome to share those. You've got them.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Well, thank you.
Thank you all.
I have one final slide for everyone, just for upcoming. And Jenna, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, especially knowing it's such a busy day for you. I just want to make an announcement quick about our upcoming series. We have one coming up on March 3rd. It's with the founder of Emergent 3D, Matthew Gile. He's going to be talking to us about 3D home printing. They're getting it from a company, hopefully next month, where they'll actually go on site with 3D printer and construct homes. And their first 2 housing projects in California will be in the town of Reading, and they hope to begin that process in April. So it should be a really interesting conversation with him. And so I encourage you to come. It will be March 3rd from 4 to 5 p.m. And then we will also have Gabby Velasco on March 8th, who will be talking to us kind of about the intersection of climate crisis and housing crisis. And that too will be a very interesting panel. So you can register for both of those on our website, mountainhousingcouncil.org. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate the community engagement, and thank you, Steve. Thank you, Devin. It was very helpful information.
Thanks, Christina.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Nancy. Thanks, Erin.